Aftlight Station kept a kind of silence that Elena Reyes had never gotten used to, and by now she suspected she never would. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the opposite. Every corridor, every quarters pod, every mess hall on the station was wired into something the Solon called the hum, a low continuous thread of shared feeling that ran through their species the way a nervous system runs through a body. 41 Solon lived and worked on this station. 41 separate minds. And somewhere underneath all of it, if you were Solon, you could always feel the others, like a room full of people breathing in their sleep. Elena couldn't feel it. She was human, and humans didn't have the organ for it, whatever it was, buried behind the Solon sternum like a second small heart. But she had learned to read its effects on the people who did. Tonight the hum was tight. She could see it in the way the corridor lights ran a half shade duller, an automatic response tied to some collective release valve she still didn't fully understand. She could see it in the two engineers who passed her without their usual nod, moving fast, jaws set. She was sitting on the floor outside a door marked only with a number, 7C, her knees pulled up, a cold cup of station brewed something balanced on one of them. It was 2 a.m. by the ship clock, which meant nothing here, for light years from anywhere with a sun that mattered, but she kept human hours anyway. Old habit. Or maybe not a habit. Maybe just the last thing she had left that was entirely hers. Down the corridor, a maintenance drone rolled past on its slow nightly circuit, pausing briefly to scan her, decide she wasn't a hazard, and continue on. Aftlight Station wasn't large as stations went, a modest ring of habitation decks strung along a research spine, built originally to study a binary system nobody outside the Concorde had ever heard of and repurposed, over the decades, into something closer to a way station for Solon who needed care that couldn't be given at home. It smelled faintly of the recycled mineral-rich air the Solon preferred, a little sharper than human air, something like wet stone after rain, and Elena had stopped noticing it around month 3. She noticed everything else about this place instead. The way footsteps here carried differently through decks built for a species slightly heavier than her own. The way every door had a small glass panel at exactly Solon height and nothing at hers, so she'd learned to knock instead of look. The particular, specific quiet of a hospital that had never needed the word hospital, because nobody here stayed sick for long enough to need one. That was the thing that had drawn her to this posting in the first place, 8 months and one very strange interview ago. A Concorde recruiter, visibly uncomfortable, had explained to her that the Solon had achieved something remarkable and were now, quietly, running into its limits, and needed someone from a species that had never solved the problem to help them remember what the problem had actually been for. Behind that door was a woman named Yara Thess, 71 years old by Solon reckoning, which put her somewhere past 110 in Earth years, though the two species aged so differently the comparison barely meant anything. Yara had spent 60 of those years painting. Not with brushes. Solon artists worked in something closer to sculpted light, images built in layers of memory and emotion that they could press directly into a surface and let another mind read the way a human might read a photograph, except richer, except sadder, except somehow more honest than a photograph could ever be. Yara was, by every account Elena had heard since arriving 8 months ago, one of the finest the Solon had produced in a generation. She was also dying, in the slow, specific way her body had chosen to die, a wasting condition in her nerve tissue that had no cure anywhere in Concorde medicine, and would not have one in the handful of months she had left. And in 6 hours, according to a schedule set 2 weeks ago and confirmed twice since, Yara Thess was supposed to walk into a small clean room 3 decks up and let a machine end her life without pain, without fear, and without any further loss of dignity. That was the whole point of the crossing. Elena understood that. She had sat through the briefings. Painless. Instant. Chosen. The Solon had built an entire civilization around the idea that suffering, once it became inevitable and useless, should simply be switched off, the way you'd cut power to a room nobody was using anymore. It was considered the kindest thing they had ever built. Nobody on this station, in this system, in this whole quiet stretch of the Concorde, would have called it anything but mercy. Elena had asked Yara, 3 days ago, whether she wanted to go through with it. Yara had looked at her for a long moment with those wide grey sullen eyes, the kind that never quite blinked the way a human's did, and said, "I don't know anymore. I used to be sure." That was the crack. That was the whole reason Elena was sitting on a cold floor at 2 in the morning instead of asleep in her own quarters 2 decks down. Because a Solon artist who used to be sure had stopped being sure, and in 6 hours somebody was going to walk her into a room anyway unless somebody stopped it. Elena didn't know yet if that somebody was her. She only knew she wasn't leaving this hallway until she found out. The door slid open without her touching anything, which meant Yara had opened it from the inside, which meant Yara knew she was there. Of course she knew. The whole point was that the Solon always knew where the ones they loved were standing. "You're going to get a very undignified back ailment," Yara said, "sleeping on my floor like a stray." "I'm not sleeping," Elena said.
"I'm loitering."
Very different legal category. "Come in before someone reports us both." Elena got up, joints complaining in a way that had nothing to do with dignity and everything to do with being 44 years old on a station that kept its gravity plating a fraction too heavy for human comfort, and went inside. Yara was already dressed for the day that hadn't started yet, standing very straight in the doorway the way she always stood when she wanted to look steadier than she felt, one hand resting lightly against the frame. Up close, in the warmer light of her own quarters, the last 2 months showed on her more plainly than they did in the corridor. Her skin, a soft grey-green in health, had gone paler along the backs of her hands, and the fine luminescent markings along her collarbone that Solon carried like a second, private expression flickered instead of glowed, an unsteady thing, like a lamp with a loose wire. "You look terrible," Elena said, because 8 months of friendship had earned her that particular honesty. "You look tired," Yara returned. "I think we are even." Yara's quarters were the only room on R-Flight station that didn't look like it belonged to the Concorde. Every surface not needed for something practical held a fragment of unfinished work, panels of light sculpted memory hanging half-formed in their frames like paintings someone had walked away from mid-brushstroke. One entire wall was dominated by a single enormous piece Yara had been building for 11 years, according to Ansel, the young Solon aide who'd been assigned to help her the last 2 of them. Nobody but Yara had ever seen the whole thing lit at once. She kept most of it dark, on purpose, layer by layer, the way a person might keep most of their life private even from people who love them. Elena had asked, once, early on, why an artist would spend a decade on something and never show it. Yara had considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness she gave everything, then said that some pieces weren't finished being lived yet, and it seemed dishonest to display a memory before you knew how it ended. Elena had thought about that answer for weeks afterward. She still did. Smaller works crowded the shelves around it, most of them gifts, Elena had learned, pieces Yara had made for other people on the station and then, for one reason or another, never given away. A cracked little panel that pulsed a soft gold when the room's temperature dropped, something Yara had built for a grieving engineer years before Elena arrived, and then quietly kept when the engineer transferred off station before she could deliver it. A row of small unlit fragments that Ansel had told her, once, in a hushed and slightly reverent voice, were early practice pieces from Yara's own apprenticeship, kept not because they were good but because they were hers. "Tea," Yara said, not a question, already reaching for the little heating unit built into her desk. Solon didn't drink anything resembling human tea, but she'd learned, somewhere in the last 8 months, that Elena liked something warm in her hands when she was worried, and had started keeping a small stock of an earth-adjacent leaf blend that the station supply officer had sourced specifically because Yara had asked for it. That fact alone told Elena more about who this woman was than any of her artwork did. "You don't have to keep doing that," Elena said, sitting. "I like doing it." Yara set the cup down in front of her. Her hand shook slightly, a symptom, not a nervous habit, and she noticed Elena noticing, and didn't try to hide it, which was itself unusual. Most Solon Elena had met treated physical decline as something faintly embarrassing, a thing to manage privately and present to others only once it was resolved. "It gives me something to finish. Small victories. I am becoming an expert in small victories, Elena. I recommend it as a philosophy, actually, now that the large ones are getting difficult." Ansel says you're refusing your evaluation tomorrow. Ansel talks too much. Ansel is worried about you. So is everyone on this station whether they'd admit it to your face or not, and I say that as someone who's been informed, at length, in writing, by 3 separate members of the directorate, exactly how worried they all are. Yara sat across from her, slow, careful, the kind of careful that had crept into every one of her movements over the last 2 months. "Do you know," she said, tilting her head slightly, a habit Elena had come to recognize as the prelude to a question meant to teach rather than simply ask, that your species is the only one in the entire Concorde that Ansel's academy still teaches as a case study in what he calls unassisted emotional endurance? I looked it up after he mentioned it. There is an entire seminar. Humans, apparently, spent tens of thousands of years grieving each other without any technology at all, and somehow this did not destroy your species. The seminar's conclusion is that nobody fully understands how you managed it. We didn't manage it gracefully, Elena said. We just didn't have another option, so we got very stubborn about the one we had. Do you know what happens to the hum when a Solon is in serious pain, Elena? Real pain, not the polite fictional kind we perform for each other at dinner parties. Tell me. It doesn't stay contained. It leaks. Every mind on this station is threaded to mine, distantly, the way you might be aware of a radio playing 3 rooms away. Most days I can keep my thread quiet. Lately I can't. 2 nights ago I woke Director Ord's granddaughter, for decks up, from a sound sleep, because for 11 seconds I couldn't keep the pain in my spine from bleeding into the network. She's 6 years old. She cried for an hour and didn't know why. Yara's mouth did something that on a human face would have been closer to a wince than a smile. This is why we built the crossing. Not only mercy for the one dying, mercy for everyone attached to them. You do not understand what it is to feel someone else's ending, over and over, distributed across 40 other minds, until somebody finally agrees to let it stop. Elena turned the warm cup slowly between her hands. And you don't want to stop it. I want to finish that. Yara nodded toward the dark wall, the 11-year piece, still mostly unlit. I have perhaps 4 months left in this body if I go the slow way. Perhaps 3 good ones. The crossing would take that from me tonight and give me nothing back but the absence of pain, which is not nothing. Elena, I want to be clear, it is not nothing, but it is also not the same as time. She looked up. I keep thinking about something you told me once. About your mother. Elena went very still. You said your people used to have machines too. Machines that could end a decline gently, quietly, before it became unbearable. And you said your mother refused hers. Yara's eyes didn't leave her. You never told me why. Elena hadn't told anyone why, not really, not on the station, not in the personnel file that had gotten her assigned here as the Concorde's first and so far only human hospice liaison, a job title that had made almost no sense to the committee that approved it and made perfect sense to Elena the moment she'd read the posting. Because she wanted to be there for it, Elena said finally. All of it. Even the bad parts. She used to say the machine wasn't really offering to end her suffering. It was offering to end her, 6 weeks early, and call the difference mercy. She set the cup down. I didn't agree with her. Not at first. I thought it was cruelty dressed up as courage, and I told her so, more than once, in ways I've regretted since. And then I sat with her for the 6 weeks anyway, because she asked me to, and somewhere in there I stopped being angry and started just being present. It was the worst 6 weeks of my life, Yara. It was also the only time I've ever felt like I actually knew her. The room was quiet in the ordinary way, not the hum's way. Outside, the station's night cycle hummed along its schedule, indifferent. I don't think I can decide for you, Elena said. I don't think that's my job, or my right. But if you want to feel your way through this instead of switching it off, I'm not going anywhere. That's the only thing I actually know how to offer you. I don't have a technology for it. I just have me, sitting in a chair, for as long as it takes. Yara looked at her for a long time, longer than a human conversation would have tolerated comfortably, but Elena had learned that sullen silence wasn't awkward the way human silence could be. It was a kind of listening. That, Yara said finally, is either the strangest gift anyone has ever offered me, or the only sane one I've been offered in 6 months. I genuinely cannot tell which. Probably both, Elena said. Most human gifts are. For the first time in days, Yara laughed, a short surprise sound, and reached out to touch the back of Elena's hand, briefly, the sullen gesture for something like I hear you. Then don't cancel my evaluation, she said. Cancel my crossing instead. Let's see how much trouble that causes. It caused, as it turned out, an enormous amount of trouble. By the following afternoon, every level of Arflight station knew that Yara Thess had declined her scheduled crossing, and the hum, according to everyone Elena spoke with, had not settled since. She learned the details of how the hum actually worked from Ansel Voro, Yara's young aide, over a station meal that neither of them finished. Ansel was barely past what the Solon called first maturity, all sharp elbows and earnest questions, assigned to Yara's care as part of a mentorship the Concorde ran for its artists, and clearly, painfully fond of her in the specific way a student is fond of a teacher who has decided, quietly and without announcement, that they're worth investing in. It isn't telepathy, not the way your stories describe it, Ansel explained, pushing food around a tray without eating much of it. We can't hear thoughts. It's more like weather. Emotional weather. A Solon in genuine distress changes the pressure for everyone within range, and on a station this size, everyone is within range. He glanced up. Do you know why the Concorde built the crossing in the first place? It wasn't only kindness to the dying. 3 centuries ago, before the technology existed, a plague swept through one of the founding colonies. Thousands of Solon dying slowly over months, all of it running through the hum at once. The survivors called it the Long Winter. Some of them never recovered their own emotional stability afterward, even decades later. We built the crossing so that would never happen again. Suffering ends fast, or it doesn't spread. So when Yara refuses it, Elena said slowly, it's not just her choice anymore. In your culture's eyes, it's a choice that spends other people's peace of mind without asking them. That is exactly how the Directorate is framing it, yes. Ansel's frownded eyebrow ridge, the Solon equivalent of a wince, drew tight. Director Ord has already raised it twice in the morning briefing. He hasn't ordered anything yet. But he will if the leak gets worse, and it has been getting worse, every night since she made the decision. Elena turned her cup in her hands, thinking. On Earth we used to have something a little like this, actually. Not telepathic. Just proximity. A whole hospital ward could feel it when somebody was dying badly down the hall, even if nobody said a word about it out loud. Nurses used to call it the mood of the floor. It wasn't measurable the way your well-being index is, but everyone who worked there knew exactly what it meant when the floor went quiet in a certain way. Did your hospitals build technology to prevent that? No, Elena said. We built better nurses. Ansel actually laughed at that, a short surprised bark of a sound, quickly muffled behind one long-fingered hand as 2 Solon engineers glanced over from a nearby table. I'm sorry, he said, still grinning. It's just, you say things like that with such enormous confidence, like it's obviously the correct solution, and half the time I can't tell if you're joking. I'm rarely joking, Elena said. I'm just also frequently ridiculous. Both things can be true. It's very efficient, honestly, saves me having to decide in advance. You would get along terribly with my grandmother, Ansel said, still smiling, which I mean as the highest compliment I know how to give. What happens if he does order it? Then 2 orderlies escort her to the crossing suite whether she consents or not, on the grounds of collective harm prevention. It has happened before. Rarely. Only in extreme cases. Ansel's voice dropped. I looked up the last one. It was 40 years ago. The Solon involved fought it in the corridor. They had to sedate her first. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the station's recycled air. That's not consent. That's just a slower kind of the same thing you're trying to prevent, except now everyone gets to feel her being dragged there instead of dying naturally. I know, Ansel said quietly. I've thought the same thing. I haven't said it out loud to anyone but you. They sat with that for a moment, the mess hall's low murmur washing around them, other Solon eating in the particular contained way Elena had come to recognize as people trying very hard not to look like they were listening. There's an old story, Ansel said eventually, almost to himself. From before the crossing. My grandmother used to tell it. Before the technology, Solon who were dying would sometimes be moved into what the old records call a hush room. A shielded space, built to dampen the hum locally, so a dying person's pain wouldn't spread to the whole community while their family sat with them properly, the slow way, the way you're describing with your mother. He shook his head. Nobody builds those anymore. There's been no need since the crossing. I only know about them because I like old station schematics. It's a strange hobby. My tutors used to despair of me. Elena went very still, the way she had the night before, but for an entirely different reason. Ansel, she said carefully, does Aftlight Station happen to have one? It took Ansel 2 days of quiet digging through archived engineering schematics, most of it done off shift, before he found it. Deck 2, a maintenance section that hadn't been reclassified or repurposed in over a century, tucked behind a bulkhead labeled, uninterestingly, as an old atmospheric buffer relay. According to the specs Ansel pulled, the buffer relay wasn't decorative. It was real, and it had originally been built to do exactly one thing: dampen the local hum signal in a small sealed chamber so that a family could grieve without broadcasting their grief to the entire station. It's called a hush chamber, Ansel told her, practically vibrating with the discovery, spreading a tablet full of decades-old diagrams across the small table in Elena's quarters. Pre-Concorde tech, mostly abandoned once the crossing came into use everywhere, but our flight's old enough that it was built with one, and nobody ever formally decommissioned it. It's probably been sitting there unused since before either of us were born. Does it still work? That, Ansel admitted, is the part one don't know yet. He pulled up the last recorded maintenance entry, dated so long ago the station's own systems had trouble formatting it correctly. Buffer relay decommissioned per Directive 4, atmospheric load transferred to primary systems, chamber sealed pending reclassification. No mention anywhere of what the chamber had actually been for. Somewhere in the century between then and now, Ansel guessed, someone filing paperwork had simply seen an old dampening array nobody used anymore and written it down as plumbing, because that was easier than explaining what it had once meant to the people who built it. It's strange, Ansel said quietly, staring at the screen. We didn't lose this on purpose. Nobody voted to forget how to grieve slowly. We just kept building better ways to avoid needing to, until one day the old way wasn't dangerous anymore, it was just unnecessary. And unnecessary things get filed under plumbing. They didn't tell Yara at first. They didn't tell Director Ord at all. Elena spent the better part of a week learning things about solid dampening technology she'd had no plans of ever needing to know, and Ansel spent it running diagnostic sweeps he was technically not authorized to run on decommissioned station infrastructure. On the grounds, he told Elena with a straight face, that curiosity about historical engineering was not against any regulation he was aware of, and if anyone asked, that was his answer and he was sticking to it. Meanwhile, Yara's decline was not slowing down. Elena visited every evening. Some nights they talked. Some nights Yara worked in silence on the dark wall, small sections at a time, her hands less steady each week, and Elena simply sat nearby, doing nothing in particular, present the way a piece of furniture is present, which she had learned, a long time ago in a hospital room on Earth, was sometimes exactly the right amount of presence and no more. One evening Yara asked her to describe a human funeral, and Elena did her best, fumbling through half-remembered details about flowers and dark clothing and people standing in a circle telling stories about someone who could no longer correct them. Yara listened with total attention, the way she listened to everything, and at the end said only, "You let the living argue about the dead stories. We would find that unbearably rude." Elena said that was probably fair, and that humans found plenty of their own customs unbearable too. They just didn't usually admit it until they were forced to explain them to someone from another planet. Another night Yara asked whether humans were afraid of dying, and Elena said yes, obviously, constantly, and that fear had never once stopped anyone from doing it anyway, which seemed to strike Yara as either very sad or very brave. She couldn't decide which, and said so. "You're very good at this," Yara told her one night, not looking up from the panel she was working. "Sitting. Most people can't. Ansel can't, bless him. He fidgets so badly I can feel it through the floor. Even without the hum I think I'd feel it." "It's a whole discipline where I'm from," Elena said. "Being with someone instead of fixing them. We used to be worse at it too, believe it or not. There was a long stretch of human history where we tried very hard to treat dying like a problem with a solution, and got surprised, over and over, when it didn't have one. What changed? People kept insisting, I think. Kept saying, this isn't a problem, this is my life, let me have all of it, even the part you'd rather skip. Eventually enough people said it loudly enough that we built whole professions around listening." Elena watched the light panel shift under Yara's fingers, a slow bloom of color that resolved, briefly, into something that might have been a memory of rain on a window, then dissolved again before it finished. "I think you're doing the same thing right now. Just quieter. And with a much angrier director." Yara actually laughed at that, a small dry sound, and for a moment the room felt lighter than it had in days. It didn't last. 2 nights later, Director Ord called an emergency session of the Directorate, and Elena, by virtue of her official liaison status, was required to attend. The Directorate chamber sat at the station spine, a round room with a low table and a dozen chairs, most of them empty tonight, since only a handful of members had been summoned for an emergency session. Elena had been in this room exactly twice before, both times for routine liaison reports that had taken 10 minutes and generated no disagreement whatsoever. It felt different tonight. Smaller, somehow, despite being the same size. Director Ord was an old Solon, older than Yara by a decade, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent his whole career believing, correctly by every measure his species used, that he was doing the compassionate thing. He did not raise his voice during the session. He didn't need to. The numbers did that for him. "In the past 9 nights," he said, addressing the small assembled directorate and, pointedly, Elena. The station's collective well-being index has fallen 11%. 2 crew members have requested medical leave for stress-related symptoms directly attributable to hum bleed-through. A child on Deck 4 has developed sleep disturbances her caretakers cannot explain, until you understand that her quarters happen to sit along a direct resonance path from Yara Thessa's. This is not abstract, liaison Reyes. This is measurable harm, spreading to people who never consented to carry any part of Yara's dying. She didn't consent to dying either, Elena said. But nobody's proposing to force that on her the fast way to spare everyone the inconvenience of watching. Except, apparently, you. A ripple went through the room, subtle, the sullen version of a held breath. I understand this is difficult for you to accept, given your species' relationship to mortality, Ord said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. But we are not debating whether Yara suffers. We are debating whether 40 other people are required to suffer alongside her, without choice, because one artist has decided her unfinished work matters more than their piece. That's not what she decided, Elena said. She decided her life matters, all of it, the last part included, and that ending it early isn't automatically the more merciful option just because it's quieter for everyone standing nearby. One of the younger directorate members, a station physician Elena had spoken with once or twice in passing, leaned forward. With respect, liaison, this is not a debate about the abstract value of suffering. It's a debate about whether one individual's preference can be permitted to override the measurable well-being of 40 others. If a piece of equipment aboard this station were malfunctioning and harming crew, we would not debate its right to keep functioning the way it always had. We would fix it, or we would remove it. She's not equipment, Elena said, sharper than she meant to. She's a person having the single hardest experience of her life, and the fact that your species built a way to feel that experience secondhand doesn't turn her pain into a maintenance problem. It becomes exactly that, the physician said, not unkindly, the moment it stops belonging only to her. Quieter, Ord repeated, is not a small thing on this station, liaison. Quieter is the entire reason the crossing exists. Elena felt the meeting sliding somewhere she couldn't stop with argument alone, and made a decision she hadn't fully planned to make yet. There's another option, she said. One that doesn't ask you to choose between Yara's death and everyone else's peace. She told them about the hush chamber. The reaction wasn't what she expected. She'd braced for skepticism, maybe outright dismissal. Instead, the room went quiet in a different register entirely, several older directorate members exchanging looks that carried decades of shared history Elena had no access to. The old dampening rooms, said a directorate member Elena didn't recognize, an elderly sullen woman near the back. My grandfather grieved his brother in one, before the crossing. I didn't know Aftlight still had one intact. It may not be functional, Ord said, but something in his stillness had shifted, a fraction. That technology is a century out of certification. Reactivating an unlicensed dampening field inside a station this size carries real risk. If it fails mid-use, the shielding could rupture and release everything it was containing at once, directly into the hum, all at once instead of gradually. That would be considerably worse than what we are managing now. You knew about this technology, Elena said, looking around the room at the older members' quiet, complicated expressions. All of you. You just stopped talking about it. We didn't stop talking about it because we forgot it existed, said the elderly woman near the back, her voice quieter now. We stopped talking about it because the crossing made it feel like admitting weakness to bring it up. Why would anyone choose the hard path once the easy one existed? To ask the question it all felt, for a long time, like criticizing our own parents for building something kinder than what they'd had. She looked at Director ORD, I wonder now whether that was entirely fair to them, or to us. Ord's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the closest thing to visible strain Elena had seen from him. I am not interested in relitigating 3 centuries of Concord medical policy in an emergency session, Directorate members. I am interested in tonight, and in what happens to Yara Thess, and in what happens to the 40 other people on this station who did not ask to carry her decision with them. Then let us test it properly before anyone needs it, Elena said. Give us that. A real chance, tested and verified, before you send anyone to drag a dying woman down a corridor she doesn't want to walk. Ord was quiet for a long moment. You have 5 days, he said finally. If the chamber cannot be certified safe by then, or if the hum bleed through worsens beyond current levels, I will authorize a mandatory crossing, liaison status or no liaison status. I am not being cruel. I am trying to protect 41 people, one of whom happens to be the one dying. I would like you to understand that, even if you never agree with it." "I understand it," Elena said. "I just don't think it's the whole answer." 5 days, Ord said again, and ended the session. The next 4 days were, by a wide margin, the strangest and most exhausting of Elena's 8 months on Arflight Station. Ansel turned out to have a genuine gift for old engineering, the kind that came from a childhood spent taking apart things he wasn't supposed to touch, and between the two of them, working double shifts with 2 exhausted maintenance techs, Ansel had somehow talked into helping off the books. The hush chamber slowly came back to life. It was small, barely large enough for 4 people, its walls lined with a century-old dampening lattice that had to be recalibrated centimeter by centimeter, its air recycler coughing dust that hadn't moved in 100 years. The first day was mostly failure. The lattice held a field for 4 seconds before collapsing, and one of the techs, a broad-shouldered Solon named Kor, who had clearly agreed to this favor purely out of loyalty to Ansel and regretted it increasingly by the hour, muttered that they were trying to resurrect technology that predated the station's own hull plating and perhaps that should tell them something. The second day went better, then worse. A cascade fault in the power regulator that took 6 hours to trace and turned out to be a single corroded relay the size of Elena's thumb. She spent most of that day holding a light for Ansel while he worked, passing him tools whose names she didn't know, and found, somewhere around hour 4, that she didn't mind at all. There was a kind of peace in it, doing something with her hands instead of arguing with her mouth. On the third day, they got the field to hold for 11 minutes before it dropped. On the fourth, they got it to hold for 2 hours, which Ansel declared, with the giddy exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in days, was frankly a miracle, and he intended to write it up as his thesis someday if anyone ever let him near an academy again. In between the diagnostic sweeps, Elena kept her evening visits, and one night, without quite meaning to, told Yara the whole story of the 6 weeks with her mother, not the summary she'd given before but all of it, the version she rarely let herself remember on purpose. The fights in the first week, when she'd still been angry, still certain the machine had been the kinder choice and her mother was choosing stubbornness dressed up as courage. The moment in the third week when her mother, too weak by then to argue properly, had simply reached over and taken her hand and said, "I need you to stop trying to fix this and start just being in the room with me," and something in Elena had finally, quietly, broken open and let go. The last night, when neither of them had said anything important at all, just sat together while the hospital machines beeped their small indifferent rhythms, and it had somehow been the most important night of Elena's life anyway. "I went into hospice work 6 months after she died," Elena said. "Everyone assumed it was some kind of tribute. It wasn't, really. I just didn't know how to be anywhere else anymore. Every other kind of room felt too loud." Yara had listened without interrupting, her hands still for once, resting in her lap. "You never told me the whole of that before." "I don't tell most people the whole of it," Elena admitted. "It's not a tidy story. People want the tidy version, the one where grief made me wise instead of just tired for a very long time." "I don't want the tidy version," Yara said. "I have had enough tidy things offered to me lately to last several lifetimes." They told Yara on the evening of the third day. She sat very still through the explanation, her hands folded in her lap, and when Elena finished, she said only, "Show me." Word of the chambers near success travelled fast through a station this small, and with it came something Elena hadn't fully anticipated: hope, spreading unevenly, in directions she hadn't planned for. A young sullen couple, expecting their first child, asked quietly whether the chamber might someday be used for something other than dying, some private space to feel things fully without broadcasting them to 40 neighbors. An old maintenance worker, gruff and rarely seen off his shift, left a small handmade tool at Ansel's station without a note, which Ansel, when he found it, held for a long moment before saying only that it was the kind of thing you gave someone whose work you respected but didn't quite know how to say so to their face. Even Director Ord, Ansel reported, had stopped by the chamber once, alone, late at night, and stood in the doorway for several minutes without going in, before leaving again without comment. Standing inside the small dampened room for the first time, Yara closed her eyes. Elena watched her face carefully, unsure what she was even looking for. "It's quiet," Yara said, and there was something in her voice Elena hadn't heard from her before, something close to wonder. "Elena, I can't feel them. Any of them. For the first time in 11 years I can't feel the whole station breathing around me." Her eyes opened, wet, and she laughed, unsteady. I didn't know how loud it had gotten until it stopped. That night, The false victory felt real. Elena let herself believe, just for a few hours, that the hardest part was already behind them. It wasn't. On the morning of the fourth day, the station's well-being index dipped again, sharper than before, not because of Yara this time but because of something none of them had accounted for. Word had spread through the crew about the hush chamber, about a dying artist refusing the crossing, about a human liaison arguing the directorate down, and the story had done what stories do on small stations with too little privacy and too much shared feeling. It had become everyone's story. Crew members Elena had never spoken to began stopping her in corridors, some grateful, some furious, a handful outright accusing her of importing what they called human sentimentality into a system that had worked perfectly well for 3 centuries without it. The hum, Ansel reported grimly, was now carrying not just Yara's private pain but the station's collective anxiety about the whole situation, layered on top of it, feeding back into itself. Elena hadn't expected to become, briefly, one of the more discussed people on the station. She was stopped in the mess hall by a systems analyst who wanted to shake her hand and say thank you for something Elena wasn't entirely sure she'd earned yet. She was stopped in a corridor by a much older sullen woman, retired crew, who gripped her arm with surprising strength and said only, "My husband went through the old way, before the crossing existed to spare us. I have never once regretted sitting with him. I have only ever regretted how alone we both felt afterward, with no one who understood what we'd just done together." And she was stopped, once, by a young engineer who would not meet her eyes and told her, flatly, that she had no right to bring her species' primitive customs into a system that had spared the sullen 3 centuries of exactly this kind of pain, and walked away before Elena could answer. She thought about all 3 of them for a long time afterward, and came to no tidy conclusion about which of them was right, because she suspected, uncomfortably, that all 3 of them were, in their own way. Then, on the evening of the 4th day, the chamber's dampening field failed during a routine test, all at once, with Yara inside it. Elena heard the alarm before she understood what it meant, a low pulsing tone she'd never heard on the station before. One Ansel later told her was reserved for exactly one category of failure, a hum containment breach. She was 3 decks away when it sounded, in the mess hall, halfway through a meal she didn't finish, and she ran the whole distance without stopping to think about whether running would help. By the time she reached the corridor outside the chamber, Ansel was already there, pale, one hand braced against the wall as though the alarm itself had physically struck him, and 2 of Director Ord's security officers were moving toward the door with the particular grim purpose of people who had been given standing orders and were finally allowed to use them. "Field ruptured," Ansel said, breathless. "Fast, all at once, exactly what Ord warned us about. She's all right, physically, but Elena, the whole station felt it. Everyone. At once. It was like 11 days of leaking pain arriving in 1 second. Director Ord arrived less than a minute later, and for the first time since Elena had met him, he looked less like a bureaucrat and more like a man who had been right about something and took no satisfaction in it. "That is precisely the outcome I was trying to prevent," he said, quiet, final. "I am sorry, Liaison Reyes. I gave you your 5 days in good faith. I did not expect them to end like this, but they have, and I have a station full of frightened people to answer to." He nodded to the officers. "Escort Yara Thess to the crossing suite. Immediately. Sedation is authorized if she resists." Ansel caught up to her at a run, breathless, and grabbed her arm before she could go further. "Elena, wait, listen to me. If you fight this in front of the officers, in front of Ord, it will not go well for you. There are rules about interference with a directorate medical order. I don't want to lose you from this station over one impossible argument." "Then don't lose me," Elena said. "Help me instead." Something in his face shifted, fear giving way to something steadier. "What do you need?" "Buy me 30 seconds with Ord before those officers reach that door." Elena got to the door of Yara's quarters before the officers did, and stood in front of it. "You don't have to do this the way you're about to do it," she said, to Ord, not moving. "You have a room that works. It failed once, during a test, under conditions you can fix. You don't have to drag her down a corridor to prove your system is compassionate. Give us one more chance to do this the way she asked for." "I gave you 5 days," Ord said. "The station cannot absorb another failure like tonight's. I will not gamble 41 lives' peace of mind on unlicensed technology a second time." "Then let me be the gamble," Elena said. "Not the chamber. Me." Ord stopped. "I'm not sullen," Elena said. "I'm not wired into your hum. Whatever happens inside that room, Whatever pain Yara carries through the last hours of dying naturally, none of it reaches your station through me, because I was never plugged into it in the first place. That's not a flaw in my species, Director. Right now, for exactly this purpose, it's the only advantage I have. Let me sit with her. Not in the chamber. In her own quarters, sealed, off the network, with only me present. If the dampening field is what's unreliable, take the field out of the equation entirely. Use me instead. The corridor was silent except for the low hum of the station's ordinary machinery. Ansel stood frozen by the wall, and behind Ord, the two security officers exchanged a look neither of them tried to explain. Ord studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the strange sensation of being read the way she imagined Solon read each other through the hum, some older, more careful part of him weighing not just her words but whatever lay underneath them. Why does this matter so much to you, Liaison Reyes? You have known this woman 8 months. You will likely transfer to another posting within a year or two, as your predecessors did. Why fight an entire directorate for a friendship this new? Elena thought about lying, or deflecting, and found she didn't have the energy left for either. Because 8 years ago I sat by my mother's bed for 6 weeks and I have never once regretted a single hour of it, even the terrible ones, especially the terrible ones, and I am not going to stand in this corridor and watch someone take that choice away from a woman who asked for exactly the same thing I got to have. That's it. That's the whole reason. It isn't more complicated than that, Director, even though I wish, some days, that it were. You would sit alone with a dying woman, Ord said slowly, for however many hours or days it takes, absorbing nothing yourself, offering her nothing but your presence, and expect that to matter. I've done it before, Elena said. It's the only thing in this whole argument I actually have direct experience doing. I'm not offering you a theory, Director. I'm offering you the one thing my species never engineered away, because we never had the option to. We don't have a crossing. We don't have a hum to protect. All we ever had was each other, sitting in rooms, staying, when there was nothing left to fix. Her voice caught, just slightly, and she let it. It's not efficient. It's not painless. It cost me something, the one time I did it for someone I loved, and I'd do it again tomorrow without hesitating, because the alternative is worse. The alternative is letting someone die alone in a hallway because staying was inconvenient for the people around them. Ord looked past her, at the closed door, and for a long moment said nothing at all. Behind that door, Yara's voice came through the intercom, quiet, steady despite everything. Cam Sin, she said, using the director's given name in a way that told Elena these two had known each other far longer than the 8 months Elena had been aboard. I've known you since we were both young enough to think we understood everything. Let her stay with me. Let me finish this the way I asked to finish it. If it goes wrong, blame me. Not her. Not your system. Me. The director closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something in his face had changed, not resolved exactly, but softened at the edges, the way old certainty sometimes does when it finally meets something it can't fully argue with. Seal the quarters, he said finally, to the officers, his voice rougher than before. Full isolation from the network. No dampening field, no experimental technology, nothing but a door and whatever the two of them can manage on their own. He looked at Elena. If this goes wrong, Liaison Reyes, I will hold you accountable for every second of it. I know, Elena said. I'd rather that than the alternative. The door sealed behind her a few minutes later, cutting Yara's quarters off from the station's network entirely, and for the first time in 8 months, Elena Reyes was somewhere on Arflight Station that the hum couldn't reach at all. The next 18 hours were quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence. The room's small lights stayed low, at Yara's request, and the station's ordinary hum of machinery, the real kind, mechanical and mundane, went on somewhere beneath the floor, indifferent to what was happening above it. Elena found herself measuring time strangely, not by the ship's clock but by small changes, the way the light through the one narrow viewport shifted from the pale grey of ship night towards something warmer, the way Yara's breathing settled into new patterns every few hours, each one a little more effortful than the last. Yara talked, when she had the strength for it, about her mother, about the first piece she'd ever built as a very young artist, clumsy and overworked and, she insisted, the only one she was ever completely proud of. She talked about Ansel, and made Elena promise to make sure he finished his ridiculous engineering thesis about the hush chamber someday, whatever it took. At one point, hours in, she asked Elena to tell her something true about being human that she'd never told anyone else on the station, and Elena, surprising herself, told her about the year after her mother died, the year she'd nearly quit hospice work entirely because she couldn't stand watching one more family choose the fast way, until she'd realized the choice was never hers to judge, only hers to sit through, whichever way it went. Yara listened to all of it with her eyes closed, and said only, "Thank you for trusting me with the bad year, not only the good story," which struck Elena, later, as one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to her. She talked, near the end, less than she worked, spending long stretches with her unsteady hands moving across the dark wall, the 11-year piece, filling in sections she had left dark for a decade, and Elena realized somewhere in the 9th hour that Yara was finishing it. Not because she'd decided to. Because there was, finally, nothing left stopping her from letting it be whole. Elena didn't try to fix anything. She'd learned a long time ago, in a different room, on a different world, that there was nothing to fix. She made tea neither of them drank much of. She held Yara's hand when the pain spiked and there was no dampening field to catch it, just Elena's voice, low and steady, saying nothing important, saying "I'm here," saying you don't have to do this alone, over and over, the way her mother had once asked her to, the only medicine she had ever actually needed. Near the end, in the last hour, Yara turned her head and looked at the wall, fully lit now for the first time in 11 years, every layer of it visible at once. Elena couldn't read it the way a Solon could. She could only see color and shape, waves of something like rain and something like starlight and something like a hand reaching for another hand across a great distance. But she understood, without needing the Solon sense for it, that it was a piece about exactly this. About staying. About the last stretch of a life mattering as much as any other. "It's finished," Yara whispered, and there was something like relief in it, and something like joy, and Elena had spent enough time around the dying to know those two things could live in the same breath without contradiction. She held Yara's hand until it was over, and for a long time after, in a room the hum could not touch, alone with something that would have terrified her once and now felt, simply, like the most honest thing she had ever done. When the seal on the quarters finally lifted, Director Ord was waiting in the corridor himself, not the security officers, just him, standing where Elena had stood 4 days earlier. He didn't say anything at first. He looked past her, into the room, at the fully lit wall glowing quietly behind her, and something in his old careful face came undone, just slightly, just for a moment. "The hum," Ansel said quietly, arriving a moment later, his voice unsteady, "hasn't moved. Not a ripple, Director. Nothing reached the network at all." "I know," Ord said. He was still looking at the wall. "I felt something else, though. All of us did, an hour ago. Not pain. I don't have a word for it in our language. It felt like the moment right after the hum falls quiet after a crossing, except gentler. Slower. As if it had been given time to arrive instead of simply switched off." He looked at Elena at last. "What is that called, in your language?" Elena thought about it for a long moment, standing in the doorway of a room that had held the last honest hours of a life she'd only known for 8 months but would remember for the rest of her own. "We call it grief," she said. "It's not supposed to feel good, Director. It's just supposed to be allowed to finish." Ansel arrived not long after, having clearly run the whole way from wherever he'd been waiting, and stood in the doorway for a moment just looking at the finished wall before he came in and, without a word, sat down on the floor beside Elena the way Elena herself had once sat outside a different door on a different night, at the start of all this, when she had not yet known how any of it would end. The weeks after Yara's death were not simple ones. Director Ord did not apologize to Elena, not directly, not in so many words, though he did visit the memorial gallery more often than official business required, and once, catching her there alone, admitted quietly that he had spent 3 decades believing the crossing represented the furthest his species could travel toward mercy, and had not considered, until now, that mercy might have more than one direction. The young engineer who had accused Elena of importing primitive customs never apologized either, though Elena noticed, months later, that he had begun visiting the memorial gallery too, alone, standing in front of Yara's finished wall for long stretches without explanation, and she decided that was its own kind of answer and let it be enough. Ansel finished his thesis on the Hush Chamber's original design within the year, over the strong and vocal objection of 2 separate Academy reviewers who felt the subject matter was, in their words, insufficiently rigorous for formal study. He dedicated it, in the first line, to a woman who had taught him that some of the most important engineering a person could do was simply building a room quiet enough to grieve in. 6 months later, Arthlight Station commissioned 2 more Hush Chambers, fully licensed this time, properly built, standing quietly beside the crossing suite as an alternative nobody was required to choose and nobody, anymore, was forced away from either. Yarethes's final piece hung in the station's small memorial gallery, fully lit at all hours, the first light sculpture in Concorde history that had been finished, according to the little plaque beside it, by a human hand simply staying still long enough for a sullen hand to complete the work. Elena still kept human hours, still sat outside doors sometimes long after her shift ended, and the corridor lights, she noticed, no longer dimmed the way they used to when something painful moved through the hum. They dimmed differently now. Slower. Gentler. As if the whole station, in its own quiet way, had finally learned how to sit with something instead of switching it off. She thought, sometimes, about the recruiter who had first offered her this posting, visibly unsure whether a human being could possibly have anything useful to teach a species this far ahead of her own. She wondered whether he would recognize the station now, and decided, on balance, that he probably wouldn't, and that this was very likely the point. Elena kept one small piece from that last night, a fragment Yara had pressed into her hands in the final hour, too small and unfinished to hang anywhere official, a scrap of light that resolved, when Elena held it just right, into something that looked almost like two hands, one steadier than the other, simply holding on. She never asked anyone what it was technically called in the sullen tradition of naming such things. She didn't need the official word for it. She had her own. Some nights, long after the station had gone quiet around her, she took it out and looked at it for a while, not because she needed to remember, exactly, but because some things were worth sitting with on purpose, the way you'd sit with an old friend, not to fix anything, not to finish anything, just to keep them company a little longer before you had to let the evening end. By the time the Concorde understood what they'd actually built when they engineered suffering away, they had also, without meaning to, engineered away the one thing that made loss survivable in the first place. It took a species with no hum at all to remind them what that thing was called.